My name is Lorraine Flower, and I'm the founder and one of the key players in Azzur, which is a leadership development organization. And I'm delighted to be able to deliver this webinar today and to share with you some of the current thinking around love at work. Not something that we typically talk about, I think, in the workplace, and that's part of the aim of this webinar, is to think about what is the language that we currently use, how can we develop that further, and I'll say a bit more about that as we go forward. Before I go too far into this, just to advise people that this is being recorded. We are all on mute, other than obviously me speaking. And if you want to make any contributions or have any comments, you'll notice that you've got a chat space, so do feel free to use that. That can either be to the whole group or to me privately. So if you do have a comment or something you'd like me to pick up on as I go through, then feel free to use that chat space, which you'll find in your controls. So the power of love at work. I was thinking, actually, when I was preparing for this, and which has been in my mind now for some months, that actually after seeing the Reverend Michael Curry at the Royal Wedding last week, that really all I needed to do was cobble together some clips from that and send that out to all of you, and that would really do the job, because in my view, although he went on a little bit too long, the essence of what he was saying was very powerful. And I thought that would be a good place to start, actually. Not that I'm going to preach from the pulpit, hopefully, but to share with you what really struck me as one of the kind of summary thoughts that he put forward about love. And this is a direct lift from his talk, from his speech. And the thing that really stood out very strongly to me as he was expressing this was that comparison between the huge impact on humanity when we discovered fire and how that transformed beyond all imagination the way in which we live our lives today, and the power that would come if we were able to harness the power of love. The impact that we would achieve with that would be substantial, and in fact would become the second revolution or transformation for humanity. And picking up on Dr. King's quote, that discovering the power of love will help us to create a new world. And by creating a new world, we will actually be able to move to a whole new level of relationship, of peace, and of cooperation that will, I believe, transform our world to a completely new level again. So, as I say, not preaching from the pulpit particularly, but very much in sync with what Michael Curry was sharing. So our aim today in the webinar is to think about three things. The first is, how do we overcome the stigma of love, especially in the workplace, and how do we make that more acceptable and even desirable? Secondly, to think about why heartful leadership is needed, and in what way will that help us create a new world of work. So perhaps a brief look at the emerging world of work that we're all very familiar with. And also to take a quick look at what's happening now, both in terms of some of the early research in this area, because it is a very, very nascent area. And but there are some organizations that are already starting to adopt what we might call a more heartful approach to the way they run their organizations. And so we'll share a little bit about that as well. In the time we've got available, there's not a huge amount of depth that we can get into that would be that will come as a second option. But sorry, I've just had a message through. Could I make the slides available later? Yes, I'm happy to do that. That's not a problem. Although most of them are picture slides, so they may not actually have huge value, but I'm happy to share them to the people on the webinar. So just really thinking about those three things. How do we overcome the stigma of love in the workplace? How do we help create this new world in the broad sense, but specifically in the new world of work through Heartful Leadership? And how do we make sure that we capitalize on this early understanding? And we'll see a lot of parallels with the work that's already going on in the field of engagement in the workplace. But what we're really talking about today then is the power of love at work. And it seems to me that one of the things that would be really helpful is to understand this big word that we call love and how we relate to it, how we experience it. And I mean, there are many, many definitions. There are many ways in which we can come at this idea of love, this reality of love. But I've picked out three that I think tend to colour our world, our relationship, our experience of it. The first we might describe as romantic love. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why we avoid love in the workplace, because we tend to experience romantic love in some very exposing ways. It has a strong sense of vulnerability about it. There's often, hopefully, very deep intimacy, passion, and a sense of deep joy, particularly in the early stages with all of these things. And of course, that love hopefully also transforms into many other types of love alongside the romantic love over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. A second way in which we experience love, for sure, is familial love. So how we feel in our families. And there we are seen completely, warts and all, literally, exposed in every sense, because the family members, in one form or another, typically is the place where we can be perhaps truer to ourselves, hopefully, but also where we have that fundamentally profound sense of connection, which in the case of those with children, I believe can be a very overwhelming sense, so very all-encompassing sense of feeling. And then another way in which we might experience love, and I know many people do feel love in this way, is inspired by our natural world, by beauty, and by a sense of the spirit that pervades our world. And mountains are one expression of that, water, flowers, plant kingdom, animal kingdom. There are so many ways in which we can connect with the natural world. But that sense of love that can be experienced when we connect with those sorts of landscapes, I believe, is also a very powerful expression of our understanding of love. But it's probably also worth thinking about some of the other ways in which love could usefully help us. And the Greeks have many definitions of love and go beyond perhaps the more common associations that we have with love. They don't use one word as we do. So, for example, eros, which is, of course, that sexual love, where we may then experience that sense of loss of control or an expression of passion, and again, the overwhelm. Or philia, which is a love where we're really expressing deep friendship, and that's about loyalty and sacrifice and sharing emotions. Or storge is the familial version of that, where it's in the family. Perhaps ludos, which is about playful love, children flirting, dancing, that much more expressive, fun aspect of love. They use pragma for long-standing love, often between married couples, but not necessarily. Patience, understanding are some of the qualities we see in that expression of love. And it's about standing in love, as distinct from falling into love, which we might associate with a more romantic expression. Or philautia, which is the love of self. And here we get into some tricky ground, because there can be two types of this love of self. The narcissistic version, which of course has many ramifications that are not always very positive, but also more particularly the wider capacity to love, to be able to stand in a strong sense of self-love, and from there have an infinite capacity to love others. And here I think this is a really important one, because if we think about what we're talking about in love in the workplace, it's a combination really of the pragma, the long-standing patience, understanding, creating space for another, but also this willingness to see another that Philotia offers us, the ability to connect with our friend, our companion, our colleague, the person in the street, as someone for whom we can feel love without that feeling uncomfortable or making us feel vulnerable in the way that Eros does, perhaps, in that sort of more sexual sense. And then the other definition, another definition that the Greeks use is agape, which is a love for everyone, a universal loving kindness, a love for everyone, but also for everything. And this is a very broad, encompassing definition of love. And again, is one that we can usefully draw on for the workplace space, where it's not a specific personality-based thing, but a much deeper and much broader sense of oneness. And if we extract the qualities of love, if we think about all those things that have emerged so far, we're really talking about things like kindness, caring, compassion, courage perhaps, because certainly in my experience of love, courage is something that we often will come across and associate with love, that ability to really dig into the power and the resilience that we have within ourselves. And courage is the heart, it is through the heart. But also things like vulnerability, strength, perhaps sacrifice, joy, passion, play, understanding, patience, loyalty. There are many, many ways in which we can approach this idea of love. But as we see from all of those, they are huge ideas, concepts, and they take us inevitably into the space of feeling and opening ourselves to something more. If we think about that in a workplace sense, and I'll come back to this research a little bit later, but there's been quite an important piece of work done, a longitudinal study, so it was done over 4 years, by a pairing called Bassard and O'Neill. And they did their work initially in a care home environment. And what they coined was the phrase companionate love. And if we want to kind of get underneath what that looks like, if you imagine a pair of co-workers collaborating side by side, each day expressing caring and affection towards each other, safeguarding each other's feelings perhaps, showing tenderness, compassion when things don't go well. And if you imagine that then extrapolated out into a workplace where those behaviours are encouraged from everyone, and where managers actively look for ways to create and reinforce close workplace relationship among employees, we can perhaps start to touch how an expansion of love within the workplace could be really very powerful. And as I say, I'll come back to that research in a short while and describe some of the specific impacts that came out of it. But for a second, I want to revert to what is it that we're afraid of. Because certainly we did one piece of work actually within the NHS, where we were looking at some of the qualities of conscious leadership, of which heartfulness is one. And we used the word love in that space. And of all the qualities of conscious leadership, the mention of the word love was the thing that we had the most challenge around, people feeling really quite uncomfortable with the idea of that word even being associated with the workplace. So what is it that we need to challenge in our relationship between love and work? Well, my sense of the workplace over the last 40 years has been that really it's about the concerns we have around the task, that the task won't get done, and we'll all be off down this strange side road of emotions. That perhaps when we mention love, we get into that space of soft and fluffy, and concerns about, well, this isn't a therapy circle. It's not a place where we sit and contemplate our navel or our inner self. And we've heard phrases like, leave your emotions at the door. We're here to perform and to deliver, as though there's some fundamental separation between those two parts of ourselves. And of course we know heart and head are part of our makeup. They're not separate. We may treat them as separate. We may compartmentalize them. We may seek to create a level of separation, but in fact they are still there. Or things like decision making requires a cool head. Well, yeah, sure it does. And so many decisions are as a result of a connection with a deeper feeling, a deeper sense of intuition. But without going into the history of the workplace, if we think back over the last several hundred years, we can see that industrialization and the mechanization and the production focus of work has really dominated the workplace and really hasn't left a huge amount of room for anything other than logic, hard data, and facts. And we've spent decades, literally decades, perfecting the art of efficiency and delivery and performance from that space of logic and coolness and rational thinking. And of course, we've achieved a lot on the back of that. There's many, many case studies that would support that. But that's not the whole story. And it's important for us to think about the fact that perhaps the mechanistic view isn't the only game in town these days, and that actually the world is actually changing. Life is taking on a different shape, both outside of work and within the workplace. And particularly as we start to see technology, not just in that supportive sense of dealing with some of the less attractive tasks, but starting to move much more into the professional realm, if you will, the area of the white-collar worker, not just the blue-collar worker. We can start to see that actually technology can do a lot of those rational, mechanistic activities. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us as human beings? And where does that leave us in our relationship with work? Well, relationships are the key, because in order to be able to create a place where we solve more of the world's problems and indeed more of the workplace problems, we've got to be able to relate to each other differently and tap into a new level of creativity. So let's perhaps think a little bit about this, the workplace space, and what is it that we would be wanting to bring more love into? What is the landscape within which we are currently living, or what is starting to emerge? Well, again, without doing a full VUCA workshop or review, what we certainly see is a lot less certainty in the workplace. The workplace is having to become more emergent, and it's certainly becoming more complex, as the external factors are not only things that we have to consider, but they become fundamentally part of our internal world, and we are almost unable to separate the organizational space from the collective global space of our world activity. We're likely to experience more fear and more pressure, and certainly linked to that probably more stress, and certainly our experience of working with many diverse types of sectors and client groups is that there is undoubtedly more pressure and more stress around in the workplace today, and that the old tools aren't working, that some of the toolkit stuff around cost reduction and performance and efficiency is no longer achieving the impacts that we need it to achieve. And what we also notice is that agility and flexibility are becoming far more important. So where's this leading us? What is that taking us to? Well, a couple of things really. Firstly, that we need to be able to see beyond the immediate task and be able to get into a space where we are comfortable in a more linear and more merging and emerging space, where there's less clarity, there's less definition, less specific focus in one particular area. And we need to be able to hold a lot more, which means we have to be able to contextualize and have perspective, and see things within a context, not just as a fact in their own right, and move much more into the system space, not just the individual part, but see our relationship with all things, all people, all elements, that idea of interdependency. And what is becoming clear is that empathy, for example, is becoming one of the new currencies of success in this space. And coming back to the principle that we see emerging around automation, which is that it's moving into every corner of the workplace, it's only as leaders, particularly as we start to understand our role in building effective relationships in the workplace, connecting people to each other in a way where they feel really safe, open, positive, able to connect to their full capabilities, that we will then start to see the full value of human in the workplace, because we will come from a place of creativity, from a place of expansion, and tap into completely new resources that we haven't perhaps seen before. And underpinning all of that, we would describe that as purpose, trust, and connection. So having, from a business model point of view, having a clarity of purpose, one that does help people in the organization get a real sense of meaningfulness that goes beyond profit and can see themselves within this interdependent world and interdependent space. A deep sense of trust, where there is a trust in the intentions of the leadership and the collective organization, but also a trust in oneself and with others in the relationships that one's holding. And be able to see that broader sense of connection and collaboration, and being seen as not just a single individual person, but as someone who's part of a collected and collective workforce and entity. So the workforce, the workplace is changing, and we need to be thinking about how we can respond to that. And one example that, again, I'll come back to because it's a really great case study, is of a chap called Bob Chapman, who is the CEO of an organization called Barry Waymiller, not one that we're particularly familiar with hugely in the UK, but it's a 2.4 billion US-based manufacturing technologies and services supplier. And Bob Chapman talks about truly human organizations and about creating truly human leadership. And he speaks of caring for your people like your family. And family is a really important concept, I think, in this idea of love in the workplace. Because typically within family, I know there are many dysfunctional families out there, and it's not a perfect nirvana, and I'm not trying to say that that's the case. But within family, we're more likely to find access to things like understanding, where that deep connection and relationship allows for a broader sense of who that person is. We're much more likely to come back to that fundamental sense of love that binds us. And so a truly human organization, a truly human sense of leadership, has an underpinning of understanding within that. I want to take a moment to also bring in a little bit of the research that has been starting to emerge in this space, and not necessarily specifically under the banner of love, but under aspects of love. And there are two things two research studies that have jumped out at us as we've been exploring this area. One is some work that's been done by Barsada and O'Neill, as I mentioned, and they have particularly looked at over a long period of time, over nearly 4 years now, a study of how working in a loving and caring culture affects levels of satisfaction, teamwork, but also in terms of the impact on the actual outcomes. And so initially this research was very much in this healthcare space, and perhaps in a setting where you might imagine there would be much more tenderness, much more care, much more of the basic love principles that we talk about. And in that sense, more of a focus towards the emotional. But what they also found was that the benefits that they experienced in the care home environment also followed across to other industries. When they did a follow-up survey across over 3,000 employees in 7 different industries, from financial services to real estate, and found that the results were the same. And the 3 things that they found were that people were more satisfied with their jobs, they were more committed to the organization when they were working in a caring culture, a loving culture, and they felt more accountable for performance and ultimately the way in which that played through into outcomes. And in the case of the care home, that resulted in people who were in the care homes having improved patient mood, a better quality of life, higher degrees of satisfaction, and fewer trips to the emergency room. So in that health environment, the outcome was there right at the sharp end of the client, if you will, the patient. If we come to the Roffey research, they described, they were looking more at compassion at work in the Roffey Park work, which was conducted in 2016. And so they were concerned that perhaps a lack of compassion was likely to affect the way in which people would perform at work and create pressure on performance, productivity, and efficiency that really became a point of suffering for people and create a sense of suffering. And it needed, that they felt, more compassionate work would, the underpinning concept of their research was that more compassionate work would improve the way in which people were able to deal with particularly those pressures that are starting to become really everyday realities for us. And again, what they found with their research was that it's not about soft touch or being squidgy or people being taken advantage of. There are some very fundamental realities that emerge as we start to show compassion to each other within the workplace. There is a much stronger bond that emerges. There is a much stronger sense of connection with the organization. Supervisors or managers who behave in a compassionate way and who perceive that as part of the organization's values are much more likely to behave that way towards the people that they manage. And it has a sort of self-fulfilling element to it. So compassion breeds compassion. And that in itself also creates an environment where that culture shifts. So the research, fledgling though it is starting to give us something to work with. And I just want to also refer back to some of the engagement results, because as I say, there's an alignment here, I think, with a lot of the engagement study work that's been done. And McLeod and Clark, which is obviously quite old now, but still nonetheless very powerful, shows that those employees who have a low level of engagement are going to contribute just under 33% less of their full self and have that impact on the yearly income. So they'll reduce the yearly income by nearly 33%, whereas those who are highly engaged will increase it by nearly 20%, of course, average figures over a 12-month period. And the impact of people who are disengaged is that it can amount to something like 20 to 30% of their annual salary as a cost to the organization. So we know engagement has a very clear business case, and love at work is the next extension of that in many ways. So in trying to bring those thoughts and ideas together, I think I just want to bring a couple of case studies to the fore. And GoPro, which some of you will know and perhaps think is an unlikely case study, has been, having had a really powerful start to its life and really phenomenal startup business, has for some years now been facing both financial challenges and a lot of uncertainty about its future. And the senior director of organizational development at GoPro, a lady called Michelle Bousquet, has really started to focus on the quality of leadership and the way in which leaders respond and behave. And she wanted and is working on moving leaders from that knee-jerk response to pressure, where it's, what are we going to do? That very stress-laden response, into thinking about who do we want to be and how should we show up each day. And that's quite a big challenge, of course, when we feel under that sort of pressure. But if you can start that from the top and really believe in that, then you can start to see that shift through the organization. And by building that stronger culture, they're hoping they will be able to shift. Now, this is early days for them, and as yet still to be proven, but that's her commitment to how they solve some of the challenges that they're facing. And again, coming back to Barry Waymiller and Bob Chapman, he took over the organization from his father, and it was all but ready to collapse at that point. And he felt that, in fact, he would hold the organization that his father set up as responsible for his father's death. But actually, what he felt when he took over was that the solution lies in leading with and through the heart and not the wallet. And that is exactly how he has gone forward. As I said, he talks about truly human leadership, and he's created a culture based on that across the 12,000 employees within the organization, all of whom are considered as family members. There's that idea again. And he puts this succinctly in his philosophy, that is, everybody matters. It's not about one person or another person being more or less valuable. It's about everybody matters. And if we come back to the Bassard and O'Neill work, when they went out to these other organizations, also found evidence of love in the workplace in companies like Whole Foods, PepsiCo, and Zappos. And some of you may know that Zappos, the shoe manufacturers, are very active in introducing holacracy, and a very risky, one might say, but very adventurous form of organizational design, structure, relationship, and interaction, where the command and control structure has really been taken as much out of the system as they possibly can, and replacing that with more of a sense of community, collaboration, family again. So there are some early examples where people are daring to get into that sense of humanness and bringing forward the qualities of love in the way in which they design their organizations and their leadership. Conscious that we only have a few more minutes, and I don't want to take up any more of your day than you've already committed, and I appreciate that. But I do want to just spend a couple of minutes looking at what does this all look like in practice. So I think we probably all get the philosophy, the concept. There is some emerging evidence that says approaching the workplace with the concepts of love and heartfulness has a value. But what does it actually look like in practice? This is a quote that really, for me, is extremely powerful. It may or may not speak to everybody, but it talks about the way in which we relate to the heart and the way in which we relate to the world, and to be able to behold with the eyes of the heart. So in other words, to see things through the heart, to see life through the heart, to listen to people and life through the ears of the heart, and to what's going on in the world, but through the heart, and to peer into the future with the comprehension of the heart. All of these things, if we can actually think and act through the heart, through love, we will have a very, very different relationship in our own life, day in, day out, but also with the people that we interact with in the world, both within our organizations and on a broader level. And what does that mean in practice? So, yeah, okay, quotes are great. They can be very inspirational, but again, we have to ground them. We have to bring them into practical effect. Well, there's a number of things, I think. It's about really having a very clear sense of love coming into the culture, really thinking about emotions as part of the culture. Emotions such as joy or pride, and of course love in itself, but again recognizing that love is a very big fat word, so we probably need to get to other aspects of that. Secondly, to pay attention to the emotions that are being expressed in the workplace between employees every day. Really recognize, not hide, not say, well, that's just the way it is, but you've got to get on with the task. Really think about the fact that as leaders in particular, our mood creates a cultural blueprint for the organization as a whole and for the group. And thirdly, think about our company policies and practices. In what way could those be expressed, written, described, that could foster greater affection, caring, compassion, tenderness amongst workers? Just a very practical example, the CEO of Cisco Systems, John Chambers, this is the CEO, asked that he be notified within 48 hours if a close member of an employee's family passed away. Now, of course, we know there'll be compassion and concern locally when something as tragic as that happens, and colleagues will support each other in that space. But by bringing this up to the board level and showing a behaviour of concern and compassion, it's important that we see that as a cultural shift. It's about saying it matters. It's not just a mechanical process. It's something that I'm actually, as CEO, prepared to put my time and energy behind. It's about small moments between co-workers, a warm smile, a kind note, a sympathetic ear, day after day, month after month, that helps to create and maintain that strong culture of companionate love or compassion, and will affect employee satisfaction, productivity, and client satisfaction. It's about working in the laboratory of the heart and through the laboratory of the heart, being willing to listen deeply, which is a deep practice. It's not easy to do that. We have to be able to empty ourselves, leave space to really listen to other people, not be rushing on to the next thing that we need to do. We need to care and act kindly. Everyday philanthropy is what we're really aiming for here. For example, a coffee shop owner who gives a cup of coffee to a homeless person sleeping in the doorway next door. We need to be able to connect our head and our heart, to act mindfully, think and speak and act through the heart, breathe deeply, become present, notice what's going on, and connect with gratitude and love. So each day today, as we go out into our workplace, let us think about how we can be more warm, caring, and genuine to each person that we interact with. Let's show our appreciation to each other every single day. And let's use our own strengths joyfully in our work and be proud of the talents that we have and the talents that others have as we build these things, these workplaces, these entities that we attend for so many hours every day that are such a fundamental part of our lives. Let's build a family where people actually feel cared for, supported, but also able to give of their best.